This video is going to attempt to show you that you can rationally believe that a panpsychist framework is just as acceptable as the current materialist framework. I will argue that consciousness is not a product of the brain, but rather that the brain functions as a filtering and localizing mechanism for a more fundamental unitary awareness. In this view, the brain does not create experience. It constrains it into an evolutionarily useful, embodied, self-reflective form that grounds our sense of individuality and agency. This framework rests on two axioms that will be motivated but not proven. First, that conscious agents experience genuine freedom of choice, and second, that there exists a unitary awareness underlying reality as a whole. The goal here is not to solve the hard problem of consciousness, but offer a conceptual framework that takes lived experience seriously rather than explaining it away. If you've been feeling isolated, depressed by the lack of answers, abandoned by a seemingly proven to be meaningless universe, I will attempt to show you that you can actually rationally believe that you are the universe experiencing itself. I will be asking you to question deep-rooted, even unconscious cognitive frameworks. This isn't brain rot and will take effort to appreciate, but I know I'm targeting people who may need just such a thing. The underlying motivation of this video is to show you that from these base ideas, which can be sometimes intuitive, you can rationally deduce a conceptual framework that answers big questions in current consciousness studies and phenomenology. But before we start, we need to get two definitions out of the way. I will be talking about awareness and consciousness. These two are different. Awareness is bare existence. It is a presence. You can see it as a field of awareness that pervades the entire universe or Brahman. Consciousness, however, is a subset of this universal awareness that is self-constrained, self-reflective, perspectival, and choice-oriented. The first two parts of this video will be trying to show you that the idea that awareness is a unitary field and that free will exists is still backed by empirical science to this day, regardless of what you're told by Neil deGrasse Tyson. In all of these sections, I will be first starting from an outer observation and then focusing on our inner subjective experience and trying to tie this together. Part 1. Where is our awareness located? This may seem like a simple question. Most people think it is inside our head nowadays. But if we are part of a unitary universal awareness, then our awareness need not be contained within the skull. Indeed, perception works better if it isn't. But first, let's look at the science. Where does the inside of your head actually begin? At the atomic level, there is no clear boundary between the body and the environment. At the subatomic level, things get only more blurry as particles are impossible to locate in space with the categorical precision this statement implies. When you get to quantum field theory, all bets are off. There is no real boundary between anything since everything is a field, or multiple fields. You may then counter that awareness comes from the processes inside the brain, thereby precisely confining it to the inside of our heads. But it is also clear that the environment we consider as outside the body has a direct influence on what happens inside the brain. The light, sound, molecules in the air, and many other physical factors directly create patterns of nervous stimulation inside our body that all end up affecting brain activity. To describe the pattern of a brain activity correlated with seeing something, would you begin at the visual cortex, the retina, the photon that hits the retina, or even when the photon is emitted from the object? From a neutral outsider perspective, the process of seeing a flower and picking it up is continuous from the moment a photon is emitted from the flower, is converted into electrical energy by your nervous system, up until the moment your fingers clench the flower. It is a continuous series of interactions between photons, nerves, and the matter within a unified environment. If consciousness is a process, it cannot be confined to the body, but rather, the body is just another element of the universe that is implicated in the process. The idea that awareness suddenly appears inside the skull is not an empirical observation, but a metaphysical assumption. This comes on top of the idea of physical boundaries completely dissolving when you zoom into matter enough. Moving on to the inner observation of awareness. In these sections of the video, I'm asking you to focus on your qualitative, subjective experience. This will probably come more easily to meditators and casual enjoyers of experience, but I choose to include include this angle of inquiry because our experience is as much part of a universe as anything else. Thus, a good theory should explain those too, regardless of what current science claims. Take a moment to look around you. Take a moment to feel the objects around you in space. Do these objects feel like they're outside your body, or do they feel created from within your body? When someone is behind you, where do you feel their presence? Does your awareness really stay confined to the bounds of your body? When you hear a sound, where is it located? As we saw just a moment ago, nothing truly forces awareness of things to be contained within the brain other than our metaphysical assumptions. In this framework, awareness is seen as a universal field phenomenon that extends into the space we occupy and beyond. Would it not make more sense that you see and feel the object out there at some point in space because your awareness is also located at that point in space? You're as much the rock you see as your body. There is no need to reconstruct its image using neurons. On some level, everything is part of everything else. This also aligns with theories of holographic reality, according to some math-savvy physicists, where any point in space contains information or perspective on any other point. Now let's think about free will. This is the second assumption or axiom we're making that cannot be proven, but I'm trying to back up via giving you some empirical evidence. It ties back to the role of the brain under this framework. If free will were real, then wouldn't science have given us example of such a thing taking place within the brain? Interestingly, I think the issue is far from resolved. When we observe the brain and nervous system, it is extremely rare to notice precise, deterministic, linear, contained sequences of neural activation in response to a sensory stimuli. The only time we see the nervous system take input from the environment and emit a certain type of predictable, consistent reaction systematically is reflexes, which are unconscious. Rather, in what we call conscious life, we see an array of brain regions light up in response to sensory stimulation. On top of this, when a human being exhibits motor movement, brain imaging studies show a collapse of widespread cortical activation into a more simple activation corresponding to motor movement. Here we see that a stimulus can activate multiple brain areas at the same time, and then it is extremely difficult to predict which of those will remain activated and lead to their associated reaction, while all other regions collapse into inactivity. I will link you a study that talks about this phenomenon more in depth if you want to read more. On top of this, these types of phenomenon where we see probability distributions of future behavior appears also in quantum mechanics, where all operates under a distribution of possible yet fundamentally unpredictable outcomes, which are random according to a prominent interpretation. The randomness science describes in quantum mechanics is by definition events we cannot predict with mathematical equations. What if randomness is just the way physicists interpret the fact that the future is clearly not set? In my view, this hints that the universe is actively co-creating a new present moment every time a wave function collapses, leaving room for free will to enter the picture. Think about it. If physics cannot predict the future, free will is completely compatible with current science. I'm not claiming quantum mechanics explains consciousness. I'm pointing out the structural similarity between brain states in active decision-making and unobserved quantum states. Both involve irreducible openness rather than fully predictable trajectories. Here we see that the future is underpinned by possibility arrays rather than being fixed. It's not only compatible with observations of nervous system, but also seems to be a fundamental structure of how reality operates moment by moment. If free will were really part of the universe, I argue it would look something like what we're currently seeing in science, and why we are struggling so hard explaining it away. Going back, observe your inner subjectivity once more. At any point in time, what is the most obvious observation you can make about your own consciousness? I'd say it's freedom of choice, all the actions you have at your disposal. What is more intuitive and universal to humans, and I'd say animals as well, than the awareness of the possibility of action or non-action we have at any point? When we look at empirical and neuroscientific data, we see an electrical pattern emanating from sensory organs being brought up to the brain, expanded into broad activation that then can be collapsed into a singular motor output or behavior, or even lack thereof. we see that the brain and body do not immediately react to stimulation. Instead, they seem to store the energy of the stimulation into distributed brain activity. This stored energy can then be rerouted to multiple unpredictable types of reactions, and this is where free will intervenes. Explaining how this distributed cortical activity corresponds to multiple types of motor movement and the causal mechanisms that convert neural activation from specific brain regions to specific movements is not an issue for modern neuroscience. However, explaining how this broad activity collapses or how it may be co-creating conscious subjective qualitative experience still needs to be explained. This is also known as the hard problem of consciousness. Current neuroscience explains how movement is initiated, but not how sensation and perception are created by the same thing that creates the movement. I'm defending free will at the brain scale, which means I'm defending the idea of a non-deterministic macroscopic neuronal mechanism for how action is chosen. Some may claim such a mechanism is unscientific, but I'd point out that this is also the case for emergence theories of consciousness. Emergence states that consciousness unpredictably arises out of the complexity of the interactions in the brain. However, all scientific theories in the field of emergence, such as weather prediction, at least give us a causal deterministic mechanism for the emerging phenomenon, in such a way that we can model it using computers. We have no such mechanisms for the emergence of consciousness, making this theory non-mechanistic as well. At least if you accept the idea that free will genuinely exists, it will match with your own subjective conscious experience of life, and it will also naturally explain how individual consciousness arises out of unitary awareness. Indeed, I'm about to give you a mechanism for how embodied consciousness can naturally arise out of the unitary universal field of undivided awareness. Before we move on to the next part, it's important you understand what I'm saying the brain does. I'm saying the brain is an organ designed to provide an array of reactions in response to nervous stimulation. An array that free will helps us choose from, making the body a zone of indeterminate or free reaction to environmental stimulation. Part 3. The body as a zone of indeterminacy. So far, we have not answered the big questions. Why does consciousness seem located from the perspective of my body if awareness is fundamentally everywhere? And if awareness goes beyond the body and out into the environment, why does conscious perception only arise when electrical activity reaches the brain? These are blockbuster proofs that the brain generates consciousness. But if the brain is part of the universe and is designed to provide arrays of choices, this universal awareness would become dual, an awareness of the zones of the universe that cannot be controlled, and also an awareness of the choices provided by zones of the universe like the brain. Free will is a property of this universal awareness who could then choose among these possibility arrays. You can see now that awareness is both aware of choices and can choose from them, which starts looking kind of like consciousness, giving rise to the illusion of two phenomenological layers of reality, what we call the inner mind that chooses action, and what we call outer awareness, what we call sensation and perception, of an uncontrollable external universe. In this view, however, there is no sharp ontological divide between matter and mind. Some parts of reality stimulates while others react, and awareness actively differentiates between the two. But why is our mind seemingly locked within the perspective of the body? The choices available are a function of the environment and the type of systems that generates the choices. Hence, the type of nervous system and its complexity would heavily influence the choice arrays available to the universal awareness turning into consciousness. Through evolution, the laws of natural selection would select the best choice arrays for survival. In turn, this would force the conscious part of the global awareness to be turned towards survival as well. We can imagine that this consciousness, being aware of the entire universe, plus its own control of the nervous system, would not be very adaptive. To survive, the brain would need to evolve to tune down the global universal awareness into only what is necessary, the perspective of the individual consciousness. To survive, the universal awareness would need to be filtered down to 1. The outer environment that stimulates the nervous system, like predators, food, and mates, and 2, the type of reaction the consciousness can have using the body. With increasing complexity of sensory organs and nervous systems, the body is able to take different sources of stimulations like photons, sounds, molecules, kinetic interaction to create possible reactions. When a photon is received into the body, it creates specific neural co-activation corresponding to decisions on what to do next. The brain, having created arrays of choices from an optical interaction with an external object, then would allow universal awareness to broaden and connect with the object that generated this stimulation. This would then broaden awareness to give a perception of color, texture, and size, which, if the possibility arrays was generated via sonic stimulation, the brain would open awareness up to auditory properties of a phenomenon. Our 5 senses are phenomenologically different because they arise out of different ways our body generates possible reactions to the environment. This implies that the brain does not create the different senses, but rather senses are real attributes of the universe. There could be possibly thousands or millions of senses we do not have access to right now because our nervous systems are not complex enough to pick these signals up and allow awareness to tune into them. Here is why consciousness can only see the front of an object, while global awareness could theoretically see it in its totality, because the nervous system has only been activated by the photons that come from the face of the object that points towards your eyes. When these photons, and only these photons, hit your retina, an array of possible choices is created, which becomes part of your consciousness. You only see something when it has provided you with some kind of energy that your nervous system can use as the basis of motor reaction. Hence, awareness of an object would only arise when the brain has been activated. Since the back of an object does not activate your nervous system, you're not conscious of it. The nature of our perspectival perception is a consequence of the nature of how choice is created by the body. The closer something is to us, the more its photons can reach our nervous system, and the more potential reactions are being created and stored by the brain. Consciously, this is represented as the object being bigger. It looks closer to us. The more details we can see compared to an object out there in the distance. The details reflect the increased degree of action we have via the nervous system. Instead of creating reality, the body acts as a perspectival filter for universal awareness. It condenses awareness into only the elements that have impacted the body and thus gave the body the energy to react. Evolutionary pressure has forced consciousness to take this form because it would kill off any other individuals with broader awarenesses that do not matter for its own survival. 4. Possible versus real action. This brings us to the most concrete claim of this framework. Possibility is a real thing. This means that consciousness should be aware of 2 distinct types of ontological elements of reality. Possible yet unrealized action and realized action. How would consciousness represent these 2 radically different kinds of aspects of reality? One of virtual, unaccomplished sets of possibilities and one of real, accomplished reality. Notice how some senses are located outside of you. Some things appear as located out there in space. Usually the vision of objects, hearing a sound from a specific location around you. What makes perception external is that your nervous system was able to take in the energy of stimulation, and instead of immediately reacting, it stores the energy into possibility. This broadens awareness such that consciousness is able to tune into the object out there in space as a possible goal to attain or danger to avoid. Possible action becomes sensory perception. All things perceived outside the body are a manifestation of the freedom to interact with them. Inversely, when a sensation is felt inside your body, it is no longer the representation of possible action, but rather an awareness of real physical action that your body cannot store or resist. The more energetic the thing impacting you is, the more likely it will be perceived as pain. This is a way consciousness forces you to immediately tend and react to it. You'll notice that touch represents both an internal felt element and an external element. Have you ever wondered, am I touching this object or is it touching me? When you're making this observation, you're noticing that you're both feeling the object inside your body, but also you feel like you are touching the surface of something located out there in space. This is because the object both generates stimulation of the nervous system and thus a corresponding choice array within the brain. This is virtual action, but it's also atomic forces displacing the dermal layer of your skin, which is real action, beyond nervous stimulation, and thus is felt inside your body. This theory can thus explain the dual nature of touch, where it presents both the awareness of the surface of an external object, but also the awareness of the object's push against your body. I find this really satisfying because this conclusion comes out of the premises of the theory instead of needing to be tacked on into a pre-existing theory. Same for hearing or sight. When you start experiencing these perceptions as felt inside your body, it's probably not a good sign. It means the light is too bright, the sound is too loud. Your body cannot store this energy into possibility arrays. Your body is actively being interacted with such strength that it might be getting damaged, and you need to do something about it ASAP. To finish, I'd like to address a few criticisms of this theory. People will say it's more complicated, but could it be actually a more parsimonious theory? This view of the universe admittedly adds two more fundamental axioms on top of standard materialism. One, that awareness is a fundamental, universal, unitary phenomenon present at all points in space, and two, that free will exists and is exploited and expanded by life's creation of nervous systems. Current science often tells us that a bundle of neurons made of inert matter is able to somehow become self-aware and create multiple completely different sensory modalities and experiences using the same fundamental neurons. It tells us that a component of the universe can represent the external universe inside itself through unknown mechanisms. Instead, this theory tells us that sensory modalities are different elements of the universe which we have access to through unitary universal awareness. Perception is not a construction, but rather a slice of a broader awareness we are all part of. This framework does not explain consciousness by spreading it thinly across matter. It explains individual consciousness by introducing constraints, perspective, and choice into an otherwise unitary field of awareness. This theory is more empirical if you choose to include internal subjective experience as part of your observations. Every human is aware of their own free will. Explaining how consciousness and awareness could emerge out of an unaware universe following fixed, predetermined laws is still a mystery. Think about it. If the universe were following fixed laws, there would be no difference between a series of dominoes falling and the brain making what we call decision. This would imply that consciousness is a redundant tacked-on element and would not naturally emerge out of theory. We do not expect dominoes to be conscious, so why would the brain be conscious? Rather, consciousness only exists under this framework because we cannot ignore the fact that it is real. Does adding an entire feeling, self-aware, perceiving element of reality in a universe that does not need one seem parsimonious to you? When a theory includes an entirely useless component just to fit observations, does that seem scientific to you? Instead, if we accept everything is inherently self-aware and free to different degrees, it could explain why nervous systems even exist. Nervous systems seem to break the laws of thermodynamics by reversing entropy through evolution. But, under this framework, they could be seen as the reflection of a will towards freedom and self-determination, a material, biological system that evolved to store incoming energy until a conscious agent willingly chooses to redirect it towards a specific action. Through evolution, we notice this impulse or drive has led to increasing complexity of such nervous systems, so that they could store increasing modalities of stimulation and use them to react in increasingly complex and dynamic ways. This could imply that evolution has a direction, expanding the scope of interaction and free action. This is the issue with scientific theories, because at a core level, many components of what make a good theory have different and very subjective criteria. This one is more complicated by explaining inner reality. Materialism is less complicated but concludes that inner reality is an illusion. If we want to get more esoteric, If we want to incorporate extra phenomenological data points that current science rejects, could a state in which we're able to disconnect our consciousness from our nervous system and body be described as pure awareness, returning to universal awareness, a state of ego death, feeling at one with the universe? These moments have been described by people taking psychedelics, near-death experiences, or deep meditation. This view opens the door for known local causation and awareness, even astral projection. Maybe some of you have had out-of-body experiences. What if it was more real than mainstream scientists think it is? These states may reflect what consciousness feels like when the brain's filtering function is disrupted, whether or not one accepts metaphysical interpretation. Edge cases are important in science, and these edge cases show us what consciousness feels like when the filter loosens. To conclude, this theory has the advantage of aligning with the empirical data seen in recent neuroscience, or at least is not disproven by it. What I want you to walk away with is the understanding that all theories of consciousness are based on the commitment to a certain ontological belief. Mine are that awareness is fundamental and that free will exists. Current theories are that everything obeys pre-ordered mathematical laws, leading us to the conclusion that consciousness and free will are illusions that emerge according to no known mechanisms, out of dead matter. This flavor of panpsychism, inspired by non-dual theories of consciousness, has the unscientific advantage of aligning with our subjective lived experience, that consciousness is real, that free will is an integral part of it. This was my attempt to synthesize the ideas of Henry Bergson, mainly in his book Matter and Memory. It is not comprehensive or exactly what he said. I mean, I did not even get to the part where he talks about memory. Rather, it is my personal extension of his work into contemporary scientific frameworks. It is not as rigorous as it can be, or a representation of my complete thoughts on the matter. I do not want to make this video 6 hours long, so this is to be seen as a starting point for all people looking for alternative frameworks and who still desire rational inquiry. This obviously invites debate. Feel free to engage in the comments, but no need to get angry. Let's try to be philosophers instead of edgelords. Peace and love always.